My name is Brian Postumus. I'm the statewide hunter outreach coordinator, and I'll be the moderator tonight for our webinar. We've got a lot of great, talented staff. They spend their lives doing a lot of stuff with goats, sheep, other wildlife out in the field. We've got some officers, we've got biologists. So we've got some good folks here to help present this webinar to you tonight. This webinar is being recorded. If you know of someone that might want to get a look at it, have them contact me. Most of you should have received emails from me, so you should have my contact. Just reach out to me. I might be able to provide a link to you as well. So, I have a couple things that I wanted to cover with you. So for those unfamiliar with Zoom webinars, let's get familiar with it a little bit. So I have disabled all of your attendee audio and video. It just makes it a lot cleaner. It kind of makes sure we don't have a Zoom bomber coming in interrupting things as well. The panelists, though, that we have up here, the presenters, we can send a chat message to you, and we'll probably send just a couple of maybe some website links that you might want to look at as well. So there is a chat button. You should be able to open that up if you want to look at that, or just kind of keep an eye on that in the bottom. If we have a new chat, it'll probably show like a 1 or 2 showing some new messages. So you can pull that up if you want to look at that. Instead of having the chat feature open, we want to connect with you through the Q&A button. So there should be a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You ask a question. We've got some people that are going to be dedicated to answer those questions as best as we can. And they may send you some answers. They'll type it out. You as an attendee, you can keep that Q&A button open, and you can kind of read through the questions, read through the answers, kind of learn along with everyone else as well on that. So if you get those questions, please reach out. You can, so this is probably the best way to communicate with us. Just use that Q&A feature. Tonight's program is going to consist of 2 parts. The first is going to be the Zoom webinar. And for most of you, the second part is going to be a separate connection. And what we've done is I've contacted everybody that signed up for the webinar, and I've sent you a PDF by email earlier today. That PDF should have the GOAT units on one, and then it has a URL link. There's a website link that takes you directly to a Google Meet, right? This is a virtual online meeting. When you hit that URL link, you open right up into it. You could hit that link right now and it's going to open up the meeting, but we're not ready for you yet on that. So about 7 o'clock or shortly after this meeting, I encourage you to open up that PDF, find your unit, hit that link, be patient because we got to get some of the other hunters involved, but we've got staff lined up in that local area. They're familiar with the area, and that's the opportunity for you to engage with your local staff. Might be a wildlife officer or a biologist. This is going to probably be a good way to get good local information there. If you do not see your goat unit in there, it probably means that we've only had maybe 1 or 2 goat hunters that signed up for this webinar. So instead of taking a bunch of time, we've contacted our staff people in that unit, and we've given them your contact information, and they're going to reach out to you directly. If you don't hear anything by the end of this weekend, I encourage you to send me an email next week, Monday, and we'll just see once we can kind of work on getting that connection in place. Our officers and our biologists are really busy right now. They're busy all through the year, so be patient with that, and they're just trying to find the time in their schedule and in your schedule to meet up. But we'll do our best to get that set up so you can talk with them. We've shared some of your submitted questions to our presenters today. We've also shared some of those questions that are specific to a unit with the folks that are going to meet you later on in this Google Meet. So hopefully we've covered some of those questions, but if you've got more questions that have come up or we haven't been able to get those questions out, the Q&A of this feature is going to be for more general goat hunting questions. For area specific, unit specific, use the Google Meet, or if you tie in with officer, that's probably going to be the best way to handle that. Let's see. The agenda for the webinar tonight, first off, we're going to start talking about the goat hunting regulations that you need to know. There's some specific ones. We're also going to review how to identify goats out in the field. We want you to be successful, but we also want you to harvest the animal that you have the tag for, right? If it's a billy or a nanny. And then we're gonna address some of those questions that you've already pre-submitted, and then we'll have an opportunity to have the Q&A. So if you use the Q&A, we're gonna try and do our best to answer those Q&As as we get going. Keep in mind that we may cover some of your questions later on in this webinar. So if you ask the question, it doesn't get answered right away, it might be we're thinking, hey, we're gonna answer it in about 10, 15 minutes. So just be patient with us on that. If you recall, some of the links that we sent you a hunt packet when you got your tag. It had a link to some sheep and goat resources that are on our website. Hopefully most of you have had a chance to watch the videos and go through that. But remember, those are that's some more information that you can use to help prepare yourself for your goat hunt as well. And we're gonna take a minute and we're gonna do some introductions. So if I can have my panel join us and introduce themselves. And Julie, why don't you start?
Hi, I'm Julie Stiver. I'm the Senior Wildlife Biologist for the Southeast region based in Colorado Springs.
And Dawson.
Absolutely. I'm Dawson Swanson. I'm a District Wildlife Manager, which is basically a game warden. And I've been up in the Bailey area, which includes a handful of sheep and goat units. And I've been up here for about 18 years.
And Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Brian Dreher, Terrestrial Section Manager for the agency. Prior to being Terrestrial Section Manager, I was both biologist and Senior Wildlife Biologist out of Colorado Springs. Just thank everybody for being here, and just want to also thank staff for participating in this event, and hope you all find it very rewarding. This is the first time we've done a virtual goat symposium like this, so thanks for everybody being here.
All right, Brad.
Yeah, thanks. Had to unmute. Brad Weinmeister, I'm a biologist out of Durango. So G5 is the primary goat unit down here in my neck of the woods.
Great. Shannon.
Hi, everyone. I am Shannon Schaller, and I'm the Northeast Senior Wildlife Biologist.
Great. Matt.
Hi, I'm Matt Yamashita. I'm the Area Wildlife Manager out of the Glenwood Springs office.
Great. And thanks for joining us, Matt. We kind of got hooked up last minute, so thank you for joining us. And Pepper.
Oh, there I am. Hey, Brian. Pepper Canterbury. I'm the Hunter and Angler Outreach Coordinator for the Northeast region.
Awesome. Thank you all for joining us tonight. We should have a good night. I think we are ready to get started with the presentation. So again, if you've got some Q&A coming up, we're going to do our best. We got some people that are just kind of running the background to help you with the Q&A. We also have the panelists that are presenting. So I am going to turn this over to Shannon.
Thank you, Brian. I'll get set up here. Okay, thank you, everyone. So myself and Dawson Swanson are going to cover some of the laws and regulation, and then also highlight some of the goat ID as it relates to nannies and billies. And first, let me just tell you that we are really hoping to give you guys a great overview of mountain goat hunting and all of the pertinent information to get you ready to scout and be ready for your hunt. There are a lot of other great resources out there, including our brochure that has some links to videos. Our panelists will be putting in links that have websites available to you. And so tonight, we're hoping to give you a nutshell of some good information, answer some of your questions, and then, as Brian said, after this presentation, we'll allow you to go into unit-specific questions. So this first part of it, if we can really refrain from asking any unit-specific questions, that'll allow us to dive into those unit-specific questions directly with your DWMs and staff. And actually, let me back up and say that I'm excited about this presentation with Dawson. Dawson and I started out as DWMs together in 2002, and we've spent time in a helicopter for hours and hours and hours flying for mountain goats. So it's kind of fun to get to present with Dawson tonight and talk to you guys about mountain goat hunting and hopefully set you up for a great hunt and a successful hunt. Okay, so an important thing to know before you go mountain goat hunting is that the standard big game laws apply. So that includes anything to do with loaded firearms, shooting from the road, times of day when hunting is legal. So all of those standard big game laws apply. And the one that I like to highlight that is important to remember as it relates to goat hunting is that the requirement to prepare meat for human consumption applies to goats as well, and that includes the forequarters, the back straps, and the tenderloins. And so as you're planning your hunt and you are planning how to get your goat out, which I hope all of you get to do, remember that that's an important part of your hunt, and making sure that you have a successful hunt is that you take the time to get those appropriate amounts of meat out. And I've hunted goats before, and I know where they live, and it's really rugged country. And so I can understand where sometimes getting out a lot of extra weight can be difficult, but that's also a part of making sure that you plan for where you're at or where you make your harvest. And so that does apply to mountain goats. This question came up in the chat, and so no hunter orange or pink is required for sheep and goat hunting. And actually in this picture here, you can see this pattern for, this was actually on a goat hunt as well, but you can see that this pattern works really well for blending into a hunt where you're going to do alpine hunting. So hopefully that answers that question. Another really important part to remember about mountain goat hunting is that mandatory check forms must be turned in within 30 days of a close of a season. And I hope all of you get to harvest a goat and get to turn it in. But if you don't harvest a goat, that form does need to be checked in as well. So the mandatory check form must be turned in on both harvest and non-harvest. And if you didn't get a form in the mail, get a hold of the Denver office and we can make sure that we get you a copy of the form. You should have got a mandatory check form with you in the mail. A few other regulations, and this just kind of dovetails onto what I was just talking about with that mandatory check form, is that all goats must be inspected by either a CPW officer or at a CPW office within 5 business days of harvest. And if you've been talking to your local officer in advance of your hunt and you've made arrangements to meet them and on the road or in town or whatever after your hunt, sometimes that's a great option. I know as an officer, I used to work in the Summit County area, so I had G7 and G16 and G6. And I loved meeting with hunters so that I could hear about their hunt and I could see the goat that they actually harvested. So if that works for you to make arrangements with them, that's one option. Otherwise, you'll want to find a CPW office that you can get to, likely one that's close to a taxidermist for you. And it's important to remember that as a hunter, you must be present to check your goat, and that the horns and skull must be attached or intact and naturally attached to the skull plate and not separated. We collect a lot of biological data when we do these mandatory checks. One, we figure out whether or not you harvested, which is good information, but we also collect a lot of data about horn length and the age of goats, and all of that is really important for us for helping us determine how populations are doing, and then also ultimately it helps us decide where we're going with license allocation each year. So there are no length requirements on a horn, but what tends to be a really important consideration for mountain goat hunters is being able to identify a billy and a nanny. And some hunters out there have nanny only licenses, so obviously understanding how to determine what a nanny is really important. But even so, an either sex license hunter would like to know the difference between a billy and nanny to hopefully have the hunt that they want and harvest the animal that they want. And I'm going to skim over some of the more important or easier ways, I guess I should say, to figure out how to determine the difference between nanny and billies. But I can say that nothing replaces time spent in the field looking at goats. And I know for me, a lot of time behind the glass and looking at goats and comparing goats to other goats and watching behavior was how I built my confidence in understanding of how to judge length and then ultimately decide, nanny or billy. And even just looking at pictures on the internet is a good way to really look at some of these different characteristics and then understand how when you're behind the glass or when your blood's pumping and the rifle or the bow is up and an animal's in front of you, helping you understand really if that animal is the one that you're willing to take home with you. Okay, so horn characteristics are probably the most sure way to differentiate between a nanny and a billy. And so on the left here, you have a nanny, which she's a quite impressive nanny. Their horns are generally thinner throughout the length of the horn, all the way down to the bases. So they have thinner bases. And when I say thinner, like the width of the base is generally not wider than the eye. And then the distance between the two bases on top of the head is also greater. And then if you look at this nanny here, you can see that the curve is more sharp at the top of her horn. So in comparison, if you go to the right hand of the screen, you can see that billy, the horns are thicker throughout the entirety of the horn. And there's a more gradual curve to the horn. And I'll also tell you that genetics play a big part in what horns actually look like on animals when you're out there. So getting a chance to look at a bunch of different goats will also help you figure that out. Bases are closer together. On some of those big billies, it will almost look like the horns are touching when you're looking at the goat from front on. And then the scent pads, which are behind the horns on a goat, tend to be larger in a billy. So these are the more sure ways to look at horn characteristics. Now I put two pictures up here of obviously mature animals, and where it gets a little more difficult is in the younger animals. In comparing like a mature nanny to a younger billy, that's where it can sometimes be a little bit trickier to determine that. But in general, these horn characteristics really help you identify between nanny and billy. A few of the other things that you're going to learn as you spend time behind the glass and really look at animals is that generally nannies are smaller bodied, and generally the group size is larger, and that kids and yearlings are in groups with nannies. This time of year when you're out looking at goats, you'll generally see that the nannies still are shedding out some of that hair. So they'll have clumps of hair on the side of their body, whereas most often right now, males already have those slicked off coats. And that's just because those nannies have spent time raising their young, and their nutrient levels are different than a billy. So that's usually in the earlier seasons that you can see that to kind of look at a difference between a male and a female. And then the urination pose is different between a male and a female. A female goat is likely to just squat with her rump near the ground, whereas a billy stretches himself out like a horse would, if you can kind of picture that. And I know we had some questions in the chat about whether or not a young billy would be in a group of nannies. And yes, they would be in a group of nannies. And even a young billy, you can, if you get a good look at him from the face, his face is going to be short, which is indicative of a young animal, but he's still going to have those bigger bases on the bottom. And looking at that eye, the base of the horn in relation to the eye is a great help. And billies, especially mature billies, are mostly solitary or likely to be found in a group of 2 to 3. It would not be uncommon, at least, in my experience when I've hunted, there would be 2 or 3 mature billies in kind of the same bowl together. So if you see one goat in a really rocky area all by itself, midway up the ridge, that most likely is going to be a billy. And if you see goats down in the bottom and in a big group, and you're talking 7 to 12, that's most often going to be a nanny kid group. Since the females are smaller bodied, obviously, that means males are larger bodied. And then also There's sometimes a pronounced shoulder hump in billies, which is indicative of it being a more mature animal, and then also of males. Going back to some of those regulations that are important to know is that after you harvest a billy, you have to wait 5 years before applying for another goat license. So if you harvest a goat, then you are out for 5 years before you can apply again, and you cannot accrue preference points during that 5-year period. So again, like I said, I hope you all get one, and nanny or billy. And then if you do, you have to wait 5 years to be able to apply for another license and to accrue points. And as you know, in the goat world, it takes at least 3 points to start getting into a unit. So after your harvest, you're at least 8 years out really of being able to get back into the game for another hunt. And then just an important reminder that if you fail to return your harvest form and indicate that you did not harvest more specifically, there also is a hold on your ability to be able to apply for mountain goat licenses. So that's also a really important reminder to get that form turned in one way or the other. Okay, so this screen here, I like to put it up, one, because they're all pictures that I took during my mountain goat hunt, which in fact was the most spectacular hunt that I've had. And that includes moose, bighorn sheep, deer, elk, pheasant, small game, big game, you name it. Mountain goat hunting is my absolute favorite hunt of all times. And these are just some of the different pictures that I took during my hunt. And with that, I want to say good luck. I hope that all of you have the experience that I had, which was every bit of scouting and effort that I put into my hunt was rewarded to me and getting the exact goat that I wanted. But I also got to see great country, see a lot of goats, and got in the best shape probably I've ever been in my life. And so with that, I would like to offer up to Dawson Swanson, who also has hunted goats before, and see if I missed anything that's important for you guys to know, or any tips he wants to pass on to you before we take it over to questions.
I appreciate that, Shannon. I think you did a great job of really an overall summary of goats and goat hunting and all the rest. I think we can hit a little bit more on biology, but one thing I did want to reiterate is just the fact that for me personally, and my recommendation to you guys when you're hunting these is make certain for those who have the nanny tags that it is truly a nanny. Don't depend on the size of the group or things like that as your indicator. I would agree with Shannon. The best thing that I have found is using the horns as a comparison, because a lot of the other comparisons that you read about online talks about larger than, Billy being larger than a nanny and those sort of things, but it would take a large group to actually have that opportunity to see more than one animal. And the horn, you can make that determination when you only have one animal in your view. No, I think that was pretty good. I guess from here, I'd just like to go to questions and see if we can reiterate it. Like Shannon said, the other question we get a bunch is the orange, and that's not required. It is recommended, but not required for sheep and goats. But yeah, if you want to hit some of the questions that they posed earlier, I think that'd be a good spot to go.
Thanks, Dawson. One thing I wanted to clarify is I misspoke earlier. I don't know, my brain was on billies, I guess. Just to clarify that if you harvest a nanny or billy, you have a 5-year waiting period after you harvest. And then as Dawson was talking, one more thing I thought was important to remind people is that even on an either sex tag, you're required to retain evidence of sex naturally attached to your carcass. So whether you have an either sex or a nanny only tag, it's important that you remember to retain evidence of sex on your carcass. So with that, let's turn it over to some questions. We had some questions that came in advance of the meeting, and between Dawson and I, we're gonna bounce around and try to answer some of those questions, and then we'll also take questions that came in previously. So I think I answered the question about an immature billy being with nannies. And like I said, yes, it is very common to have yearling billies, especially hanging around in those nanny kid groups. And so like Dawson said, you know, you really want to look at the horns and get time to compare. And I would say that that's probably the trickiest comparison, is a mature nanny and a younger billy. And if you think about it, it's like putting pieces of a puzzle together, right? Like you see the horns and you compare it to other goats, and then maybe you watch the urinary posture. Maybe you watch if there's a kid in the group, does it come up to the animal that you're watching? So just spend the time to put the parts and pieces together to really help you decide if in fact that's the animal you want to shoot, or if you have a nanny only license, that it is in fact a nanny only. One more question, and this is a good question. I'm glad it got brought up. It had to do with recreation. And if you've been scouting for goats, or you've even just been in your unit before you had a goat license, you know that there are a lot of people out recreating right now. And some of the units that we hunt goats in also have a lot of people out there. And what I would recommend to you is that as a hunter, that you remember to, you know, represent us as hunters out in the field, and take care to understand the public view, and making sure that, you know, none of us are contributing to a negative situation, either for you as a hunter or as a recreator. And obviously we are excited you're out there, and we support hunters being out there, but we just want to put that note of caution that right now there are a lot of people out there. So just pay attention to where you're at and who's around you. The laws do protect hunters so that they are not harassed by non-hunters or any other public. And so there are laws to protect you. And so if you're in an area with a lot of people, just pay attention to where you're at and where, you know, where the goats are. Think about those things about where's my goat going to go if I shoot it and it doesn't go down right away. They're really hardy animals. Their lungs are huge, and they don't just drop like a sack of potatoes usually, right? Like they're going to stand there and figure out what's going on depending on the hit. And so just think about where could it travel and where could it go. But yeah, there are a lot of recreators out there. If you have concerns about your particular unit and any recreation, I'd recommend you get in touch with your DWM and just make sure that you get all of your questions answered about any concerns you have that way.
I'll touch on that too with the recreation. A lot of the areas which you guys will be goat hunting are rather remote, but there's also a bunch of ATV trails and some of these roads that go up the mountains or whatever else. If it is a Forest Service road and has a marker on it, and you can legally take a motor vehicle, you cannot shoot from those. So those rules do apply to those roads, even if it's looks like just a 2-track up there. If it is a legal federal state road, then you are prohibited from shooting from that or across that road. With that said too, I know the popularity of e-bikes is greatly increasing. If there are areas that are closed to motorized vehicles, the Forest Service sees and treats an e-bike as a motorized vehicle. So you can't take those down closed roads. One exception to that I'm aware of would be Mount Evans, and that's a paved road, but that is not, that's managed by CDOT. So that would be the exception to the rule. But other places you can't take e-bikes anywhere you couldn't take an ATV or a vehicle.
Hi, Shannon and Dawson. We have several questions in the chat right now about the evidence of sex requirements. And the two kind of themes that we have is, if you bone out your goat, how do you retain evidence of sex? And then the other question is the head naturally attached? Is that also evidence of sex? So can you guys expand on what we mean by evidence of sex, and then how to handle those situations in the field where you're boning out your goat, and how to retain evidence of sex when you're boning out your meat?
I can take that, Julie, and Dawson, please expand on anything I missed. So it's the same situation as deer and elk. If you end up taking the head off and away from the carcass, which likely you will do if you cape it out, you decide to bone it out, which likely you'll do if you're somewhere really rugged, you need to leave evidence of sex. So some sort of indication, whether it's a male or female, attached to a major portion of meat. So it's exactly the same as all deer and elk. I mean, I encourage you to bone out your meat and save the weight and make sure you get it all out. But at the same time, when we say major portion of meat, I mean, we're talking like a hind that's boned out. Leave that evidence of sex naturally attached to it. You can bring a baggie or you want and wrap it around it to keep it off the meat. But if you detach the head from the body, evidence of sex, so some indication showing male or female to a major portion of meat. And then along those lines, before you go, this isn't really tied to evidence of sex, but it made me think about it with caping it out, is get a hold of a taxidermist if you're going to use one and get tips on how you want to cape it out to make sure that you do it the way they want it. If you decide you're not keeping the cape and you just want the head, remember that head needs to come out and the skull needs to be intact. And so Dawson, anything you want to tack on to that if I wasn't clear?
No, that was for me, but I also do this quite a bit. I know there are some videos that we have online that go over what's considered gutless quartering and things like that. And Shannon's right. I mean, I'll quarter out just about anything that I have the opportunity to do so. And if you can take a goat out whole and not have the head removed, I'm pretty impressed. You're probably going to be skinning it out. If you want to do a life size, that's fine. Shoulder mount, whatever else, but that head is probably going to be removed from the rest of the carcass. Then you can quarter it out. I usually leave evidence of sex on both of the back 2 quarters. And when I'm packing stuff out, that's a manageable load. Something else I'll hit on is goats kind of come in 2 sizes. And the larger of the 2, it'll probably take you 2 trips or at least 2 people. And that could be 65, 75 pound packs just in hide and meat. And that would be 2 trips of that. So be prepared. Let's see, as far as skinning it, a lot of taxidermists will want it dorsally skinned if you're going to be doing a full body mount. So that would be coming up right down the back and through some of that long hair along the spine. But it really depends. So do chat with them, and everyone's got their own preference on how they want it done. The last thing you want to do is to ruin that trophy after it's taken you, 17, 18, 20 years or whatever to draw this tag is to mess it up because you didn't take the time to go ahead and chat with your taxidermist about that.
Someone asked the question if you have to take the hide out and you do not. With a goat, that tends to be a part that people are really interested in because the hair is so pretty and unique, but you do not have to take the hide out if you don't want to. Like I said, the skull and the horns and then the meat are the 2 pieces that you absolutely do have to take out of the field. I did see a question earlier, a question about, is it important to get in the dark and be there at first light and stay? And I would say yes. In my experience, at least, a lot of times those goats are, they're at the first light, they're finding places where they're going to go bed down for the day. And if you want to watch where they feed and then where they bed down and then where they get up to feed and start to pattern them and learn their behaviors, that's a really important thing, is to see that full day movement. I mean, goats are active throughout the day because they're getting up and feeding and bedding down. But at least for me, my tip is that, if you have an area you want to hunt, you want to learn where they bed during the day, and you want to train your eye on how to find them when they're bedded down, and then see where they come to feed. So having that longer day to hunt them is good, but it is a species that you actually can hunt throughout the day in comparison to some other species.
I'd agree with Shannon, and Shannon's right. I've had the opportunity to hunt goats twice, and I really appreciate it. Both times I was out early. One thing that I picked up on is goats are up on their feet, moving usually right around first light. And it makes it a lot easier to pick them up, especially at distance when they're moving. Even though it's a bright white animal, usually on a back drop that is speckled in rocks or whatever else, until you get in the later seasons, and then it's white snow as well. but they're a lot easier to pick up when they're on the move than when they just decide to bed down. It might be on the other side of the rock. So I would spend all day and get in a location where I can glass a lot of country, unless I've already have one pinned down and I want to move in on them.
Another point I'd like to address, we got a bunch of questions about access and Forest Service roads or what's available and maps and that type of thing. And I would just say, as you get into your breakout groups with your local DWM or biologist, that's probably the best time to really address unit specific questions as it relates to access and how do you get to where you're going. One other question we had was related to pressure. In how does a goat behave when a person approaches? And I would say it really depends on the unit. Some of these goats are unfortunately highly trained to being around people. And I mean like really close to people. And so that answer and how they behave with pressure is unit specific. It also may just depend on your actions, right? Like someone walking around, you know, looking like they're taking pictures acts a heck of a lot different than someone skulking around with something in their arm, sneaking up on things. And so again, it pays dividends to understand your unit and the goats that you're interested in hunting and how to best achieve a stalk or, you know, hunting the goats in your area. It just really depends. But you probably know that a lot of them are highly habituated to people. And so pressure doesn't necessarily spook them out of an area.
I'd agree. Them catching sight of you or the human silhouette on the skyline isn't necessarily going to blow them out of the basin. Catching a little human scent typically won't. Some of the billies can definitely be a lot more elusive than the large nanny groups. And the thing that I typically see is when they are getting pushed or feel pressure, they'll just kind of do a little fast walk. And that alone is enough to make them hard to pursue in some of the country they live in. So typically, though, they'll go one drainage over, somewhere else they feel comfortable, maybe to some more rugged country, some escape cover, and that sort of stuff. I don't generally see them being totally blown out of the unit or, you know, to the far other side of the unit. It's usually just the other side of the ridge, a different basin, or it could be crossing the Continental Divide, and that could be your unit boundary. But again, by the next day, they're usually walking back in.
This wasn't a question, but it's a good tip for goat hunters is that, and if you haven't heard it, I hope you've heard it, but if you haven't, hopefully this is helpful to you, is that as you're making your stalk on your goat or looking at a group to hunt, it is really important to know what's below your goat. They like to roll after being shot. And so we check a lot of goats with broken horns at the office. And sometimes that can't be helped, you know, goats jump to their death or whatever after being shot. But if you have the ability to really determine shot placement on your animal and where it's going to go after it's shot, that will make your life less stressful as you're approaching. And I say that I didn't take my own advice. I mean, when I shot my goat, I at the time I had worked hard enough that it didn't matter. And as you started rolling down the hill, my heart went in my throat, and I was lucky to only break off about a quarter inch of a tip of a horn, and that was pretty darn lucky. But all of those things, as you're scouting and you're thinking about, you know, how you would pack it out, and do I have everything ready to go? I mean, hunting goats can be, you know, pretty extreme, you know, depending on weather. You know, weather changes in 5 minutes in some of these units. So all of those things weigh into your mind, and the pressure of getting a goat are all things to, as you plan your season, think about. You could have snow, and what's my route out, and what's my access in, and do I have, you know, my location of my camp marked. All of those things, really be thinking about it. I mean, in our past seminars, when we used to do this seminar in person, and, you know, survival and in preparing for being out in the Alpine was a big part of our presentation. And I hope you guys are able to acquire some of that knowledge to help you with your hunt. And I'm glad we have this for you guys. And And bear with us, this is our first year and we're trying to do the best we can to cover everything, but I would recommend that that's an important element of planning your hunt, is getting yourself in physical shape to accomplish the hunt you want, and then being physically prepared with gear and all of the knowledge so that you're safe out there and you have a great hunt.
Thanks, you guys. We have a question that came in. Do breeding billies change behavior as rut approaches? I understand the rut is in December, but will billies follow or keep track of nannies in late October? So thanks for that question.
I'll take it from my experience again, is that I would say that yes, it does. If you're hunting a unit, especially later on in the year, you may have a billy just show up out of nowhere. So the closer it gets to the rut, you're likely to have billies moving closer to nanny and nanny groups. And so what that does afford you, if you're hunting later on in the year, is that you may see a billy that you never saw all summer or all fall before your hunt. And so yes, they are making movements in and out of units to get toward nanny groups. So like with anything else, you know, if you're in an area where you have a lot of nannies, and that would be a better spot to be thinking about billies at least moving in close to those groups. And Dawson, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to.
Yeah, I'd say they're definitely moving in. What I found with my most recent hunt was I scouted up a bunch of billies in some very remote country prior to my season, and I actually had an earlier season hunt. And opening day of season, it all changed. And the billies were where I was seeing all the nanny groups the weeks and months prior to the season. In much more accessible country, which I guess was good and easier. But of course, I started off in the rugged stuff, and that's kind of the hunt I was hoping for. And it changed. So be willing to adapt to what they're doing. I don't think that those billies were going to camp out with the nannies necessarily, but they do put on some big time movements and leave some of that remote country to kind of check on those nanny groups throughout the seasons.
Great, thank you guys. We have a question in here about our management strategy. And the question is it preferable from a management standpoint to harvest a billy with an either sex tag? So Shannon, do you want to address that from our management standpoint?
I think you'll find that in units where populations are performing really well, we have nanny-only licenses, and that was intended to direct harvest toward nannies and to keep the population from going over an objective range or what we estimated the carrying capacity to be at. So I would say from a hunter standpoint, especially those with an either sex tag, you know, we really, the door's open to you having the hunt that you want. And I wouldn't say it's preferable to hunt a billy over a nanny from our standpoint. We do go off of statistics, meaning like so many billies are harvested. We estimate however many billies will be harvested on an either sex license and use that to inform how we're going to do license allocation. So from our standpoint, we use nanny only licenses to really control population numbers. And so that ultimately is where we go with license allocation in preference for nanny over billy.
Great, thank you, Shannon. I'm going to toss it over to Matt Yamashita for a second. We've had several questions about how the fires are affecting licenses and things like that. So Matt's going to go ahead and address that for everyone.
Thanks, Julie. And I'm not going to give any specific details regarding individual units. I just kind of wanted to generally provide an answer and some direction as to where to better find what's going to be specific to your unit. So the best way to do it is to contact the local office that manages whatever unit you are looking at, and asked to speak with their area wildlife manager. Right now, there's a bunch of discussions being had on how that access is being affected. Fire is very dynamic and is changing daily. So some of these access points are, either being restricted further or opened up. As some of these fires progress, they will likely occur throughout this entire fall, and they may change in a month from now. So again, encourage you to look up whichever office manages the unit that you hold a license for. Call them up well in advance, keep in touch with their area wildlife manager, and just inquire about what your options are, what their staff has had discussions with, whether it's Forest Service, BLM, and if there's anything that's specific to your license.
Julie, do we have any more questions that we haven't addressed?
Yeah, we've got several other questions. One of them is about behavior. Can you talk about the peak of rut? How does their location and behavior change? So.
To kind of build on what both Dawson and I said, like we said earlier, I guess, is that those billies do start moving around, right? In areas where you found them in the summer, like Dawson said, those rugged back bowls off by themselves, they likely are moving closer to the nanny groups. So you're going to find that the type of habitat that they're in is different. And then just where they're at within a unit is going to change as it gets closer to the rut. And so again, it's going to sound kind of repetitive, but a lot of it is unit specific in watching those behaviors of the animals. But they are moving to nannies, and they will be in different areas to get closer to nannies in advance of the rut. And I think that's the best way, or the best answer I have. And I don't know, Dawson, if you.
Yeah, Shannon, I agree with that. I also think that the movements are going to be dictated by pressure and weather probably as much as they are the rut per se. I know that in some of the later seasons, we've seen large groups of both billies, nannies, kids, everything on windblown slopes when other areas get snowed in. And so it's more what habitat is available during that time of the year. And then in some of the earlier season hunts, I've seen a big change between a first season and a second season in some of my units based upon pressure. The goats tended to move, both nannies and billies, even though they were in separate groups, move to a little bit more remote valleys after the first season and after they received a little bit of pressure. So I think there's several things that all kind of come together at once, and it's not just one factor. It's not just the rut, but you've got weather, rut, pressure, and where they just find the best feed and things like that that also come into effect. But I would be definitely looking at those nanny groups if you are targeting a billy. Just scan them over and make sure Billy hasn't bumped into them and is kind of camping out with them for a few days. Yeah, it's kind of dependent on the unit as well.
Dawson brought up a good point, and I kind of touched on it earlier, is that, I've had it where it snows more in second season than it does in fourth season in some of these goat units. And so I don't think it can be stated enough to really understand where your access points are with snow and without snow. And then, like Dawson said, those areas that have available feed to them with snow will change where they're at. And so just being prepared to have a, shift on the fly. Most of these seasons are, quite a few days. And so that weather can change over time, but planning your hunt around inclement weather and what they do for behavior and what your access points are is a key point to planning a successful hunt.
Great, thank you for that, Shannon. I've got a couple of other questions that I think would be great to address. One is, how much hair growth can be expected between early September and late September? And it looks like, Brian, do you want to address that for us? Thanks.
I only way in here because actually this is a conversation that one of our kind of mentor biologists, Janet George, and I talked about years ago. And what she used to suggest, and I don't know that we actually have data to inform this, but I actually believe it very much could be true that goats through the month of September can put on like as much as a half an inch to an inch of hair growth per week. And I don't know if that's true or not. I've heard this before, but there's clearly no, we know that waiting later into those months, and I killed my goat in early September and had pretty short hair. And I know waiting into those later months in September, and obviously this is going to depend on what season you have, but waiting later is going to mean better hair and longer hair. So anyway, I just thought I'd interject with that. Certainly, if that's something that you're looking for and that's an important thing to you, then yeah, you're going to want to delay your hunt into those later weeks if you can.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Brian. Another question that came in is, do goats have any natural predators up that high? So Dawson or Shannon, do you want to grab that question? Let me know if I need to re-ask it.
Yes, they do. When they're younger, they're more vulnerable to predators. I mean, a coyote could get a young goat or even, a golden eagle or something. But as they get older, they're pretty hardy animals. I think what kills more goats from a natural standpoint is avalanches and falls than predators, honestly. So the younger years, they do have natural predators, just like we have with all Colorado wildlife living in the alpine, I guess. But once they get to mature age, they can live a long time, and it's the other stuff that kills goats, either disease or falls or lack of nutrition and that type of thing.
One other little key that I guess I'd like to hit on that might sound a little foreign to folks, but goats aren't necessarily a high elevation animal. If you go to Alaska and places like that, they're right along the coastline. So in Colorado, obviously, we find most of our goat populations well above timberline and in areas like that, but it's not necessarily held true for the entire species. But that would be the case in Colorado.
And Dawson brings up a good point, is that while you're scouting, you're likely going to look in the alpine for goats, but there are units where goats are in the trees. And depending on drought years and habitat out there, goats will spend time in the trees. And so don't only think that they're an alpine animal. I mean, I just speaking G16, when we fly G16 in the summer, we dip down in the trees and have to flush goats out of the trees. And so they will use that, especially in drier years when things aren't as abundant in the alpine. So they aren't exactly all in the alpine, like Dawson said.
All right, folks, we are coming to the close of our webinar tonight. I know there's a couple of questions that are kind of coming out, but we really want to respect some of our other staff that are going to tie in with all of the attendees for kind of the breakout sessions on your units. So I would like to, I guess, wish you a wonderful hunt. I hope you have a fantastic hunt out there. I hope it's an experience of a lifetime. I hope, really wish that you harvest, just have a great experience. I want to thank you tonight for joining us. Thank you to all the presenters. Thank you for the folks answering the questions in the background, for the moderators. Thank you to all the staff. There's probably about 40 staff people that are working hard kind of behind the scenes to try and pull this off, trying to juggle a bunch of stuff. So we hope this was helpful. If you guys have some suggestions, feel free to email me. I'm happy to take some criticism or even praise. That's even better. So thank you for that. So in just a couple of minutes here, we are going to transition away from this webinar. You can open up that PDF that I emailed you, or if you have your chat button open right now, I sent a Google Doc link. You should be able to open that on your website, and you can find your goat unit, and you can hit that URL link, and you're going to open right into that page. We are, just be patient, because it may take a few minutes to get other people in there. Make sure that we get some of our officers that are tying in as well, and some biologists. If for some reason you're not getting linked into that, you're having an issue, or for some, maybe the staff person isn't able to get tied in, we're gonna have a couple of people that are hanging out on this Zoom session. So maybe don't leave right away until you get that Google Meet set up. So if you got some questions or you need an issue, come on back to the Zoom, ask us. We'll be here for probably the next 10 minutes, 15 minutes. So we'll reach out to you. So with that, thank you so much. Have an awesome hunt.